Hello, hi. Nearly there. We're doing so well. Everyone's doing so well. Thank you for coming to our session. It can happen here. Yes, I did almost sneak a Pet Shop Boys lyric into this web session, which feels like a crowning achievement. Thank you for choosing our session. I know there was two really exciting ones concurrently. We're not being live streamed, but we are being recorded, I believe. So there won't be any live captioning today. So if that's an issue, do let us. I'm really sorry. We also have to let you know that unfortunately Christina Newland is unable to join us at the very last minute. She sends her huge apologies, but we've still got Tara here and Jamie, who I'll let introduce themselves. And I'm Eleanor Thornley. Sorry, I feel a bit giddy after queuing for a bit. I got a bit thrown. I'm Eleanor. I am the manager of Film Hub Midlands and one of the producers and programmers here for This Way Up. So nice to see you all. And Tara.
Thank you. Hello. My name's Tara Judah. I'm a freelance critic and writer, and I have worked in exhibition. I don't currently work in exhibition. I did previously in Bristol. I've worked with Cube Microplex as a volunteer. I've worked here at Watershed. I also used to work in the video shop here, 20th Century Flicks, so if anybody's in Bristol knows those places. And now mostly my day job, or part-time day job, because I'm also caring for my son, is that I work for Mubi, and I edit critics' reviews that go on their website, but I also do some writing and editing freelance around that.
Hi, I'm Jamie Dunn. I'm based in Edinburgh. I work for The Skinny, that's my main job, which is, if you don't know it, it's an arts and culture magazine based in Edinburgh, but it covers most of Scotland, certainly in the Central Belt, Edinburgh, Dundee, places like that, in Glasgow, obviously. And yeah, you also sort of do the odd bit of freelance elsewhere, so you'll find me at Radio Scotland or Sight and Sound sometimes. Yeah, and I've been doing that for about 10 years, I reckon, around that. So.
Thank you. So the idea behind this session really came around thinking about access for film journalism, film criticism. There's a lot of conversation that goes on about what happens if you don't live in London and you don't have easy access to press screenings at 10 a.m. in Soho. What happens for local venues and exhibitors and festivals when they don't get coverage. What's the relationship there? What is film culture? It encompasses film journalism, it encompasses criticism, it obviously encompasses all of the work that everyone in this room does. But those two things don't always go hand in hand. How can we have better relationships, and how can we actually build better, thriving microcosms of brilliant activity that audiences understand, that journalists can stay at home and do their work, and that venues and festivals and community cinemas can engage with and be amplified through that. So it's really about, like, what's the conversation? How can we do it better? How can we work better? So that's the sort of premise behind this. But I think there's a lot of avenues we can go down, and we're going to explore some of those with Tara and Jamie now. But obviously we're very keen to hear from you as well. So please use the Mentimeter, and the glamorous Hugo Oddling Smee will be reading those out when we're a little bit later on. So please do contribute, because it'd be great to have that conversation, even if we're not doing it with a roving mic. Tara, could you talk a little bit about your journey in and like what it's been like for you as you started out? And
yeah, it's a long story. I'll try and make it short. So I studied literature and film at university in London. And when I finished my undergrad, I did a master's in cinema studies, both at King's College. And then when I finished those, I left London to come to Bristol, and I got a job in the video shop. Actually, I applied to be an usher here, but I didn't get the job at that time. I did get a job in the video shop, though, so I worked there for a couple of years. Then I went back to Australia. At that point in time, I think my writing aspirations were, one day, it's still very like basic. One day I would like to write for Senses of Cinema, something was all that I had in my head. Then I went back to Australia for a few years, and the industry and the scene is a bit different there, so it's, I think, easier to get into and easier to do stuff. So I did a lot of, like, I think the first thing I ever wrote was for The Big Issue in Australia, and I wrote for them for very many years. and I started out doing like little reviews, TV and film for things like The Big Issue. Then I would write for Australian journals like Screen Education, which is for teachers who educate pupils about films, and Metro, which is the kind of the other. They come out of educational, these two journals. They're like educational journals. So it's quite kind of in-depth stuff that might be like studies of films and stuff for students to do as well. Then I did loads of radio. I did lots of community radio in Melbourne, Triple R and Joy FM, which is the LGBTQI plus station. I also did ABC radio. So I did that like breakfast reviews for up on the, sort of on the Gold Coast. For some reason they did it out of Melbourne. I'll never understand that, but they did the reviews out of Melbourne, so I got that gig. Then I did Melbourne overnights, and then, and it sort of is the thing that like one thing always led to another, but the way I got into it, in all 100% honesty, is by going to a film festival. And I'm not kidding. The first bit of work that I ever got, I went to the Melbourne International Film Festival. I just arrived back in Melbourne after living in the UK for like 10 years. And I didn't really know anyone anymore. So I went to the film festival and I was like very nervously sort of standing around in this room of people who all knew each other. And I like was like, oh, no, I'll go home. Like, I don't know, what am I going to say? Just walk up to someone. And then I was like, no, you came here to like meet people and stuff. So I like turned around, went back in the room, forced myself, walked up to someone and just went like, hello, I know you from Twitter. My name's Tara, blah, blah, blah. And then that literally was like the opening of a door for me. Like, that's where I met people who were programmers, writers, radio critics. I just met people who were working in the film industry. And sadly, I know that that's not really like a route into things, but like actually just meeting people really was a really decent starting point for me. Because I didn't know otherwise how you get those sorts of gigs. And it's like, once you you need to have people that you can ask how to do stuff, because it's not like a vocational job where it's evidently clear how you do it. So even things like I had to ask people like, how do I get on a press list? Like, who do I contact? How do I get to see films in advance? Like, at that point I was just writing a blog of like stuff I'd seen. So that kind of like, I guess, got the ball rolling a bit. And then honestly, when I came back to the UK, I have done less criticism since I came back to the UK probably than I was doing in Melbourne, because it's harder here. Mm-hmm. And that was partially around my decision to come back to Bristol and not to come back to London, because, I couldn't go to press screenings, and I would always do coverage of festivals, like if I was going to Berlin or Rotterdam or something, like that's easier to pitch. It's a festival, like you can, kind of do that coverage. But yeah, it's always been a bit tricky, and like being in Bristol, at one point I started up like I kind of like found that there was someone who had started, actually Stuart Hall had started this Bristol Film Critics Circle at one point. And so I talked to him and he was like, I just, not really doing it. So I took it over and I tried to make that happen for a while, but it was really difficult because there's like there's a really hot film culture here, in that like, we've got the Video Shop, we've got Bristol Bad Film Club, we've got, the Cube Microplex, we've got Southwest Silence, we've got so many film groups doing stuff in Bristol. Like there's loads. There's like, not at the moment as much, but normally there's like too much film culture here. There's Bristol Film Festival, there's like another film festival starting, like, mm-hmm. And I know a ton of people who have got ideas in Bristol for doing even more stuff. So there's no shortage of like film culture here, but it was difficult to kind of be a critic here, because it's not like there's a version of The Skinny, like a Bristol magazine, right? That's kind of, I guess we have Crack magazine, but it's more about music. There's not much on film in there. So there's not really like a film journal or like a cultural journal in Bristol. And I think I loftily had dreams of starting one up at some point, but like I've never had the capital or the, to kind of get it off the ground. So anyway, I don't want to talk forever, so I'm going to hand over to Jamie. Sorry.
Thanks, Tara.
My story is kind of quite similar in a way. The boring route of I studied journalism and film at university as well, and again I think most people have this story. It's quite serendipitous how you get your start. My first paid journalism job was actually with the Glasgow Film Theatre. So talking about how like working with venues, and that was actually my first writing gig, and it happened because I happened to be going to a Jane Campion sort of short film retrospective, and I kicked over somebody's pint, and it turned out that person was Emily Monroe, who I don't know, some of you might know her. She was at the time the kind of I think education officer at GFT, and we just got chatting about another pint to apologise, and she just asked me what I was into, and I said I'm trying to get into film. I'm studying it at the minute. I'd love to write about it, and she says come along and write a few programme notes for us. I got paid. I mean, they had two options. I could get paid, I think, £20, or I could get 8 film tickets. Now, even when I was a student, 8 film tickets was much more than £20. So yeah, that's how I sort of paid for cinema through my uni years. I just got free tickets from writing these little programme notes, and from that, I did things like I did Sub-City Radio. I think one of my old producers is here, Phil, and I did that for a while with my friends. That was for free, sort of volunteer, and then I started doing sort of the odd little bit for the Skinny for a few years, and then lo and behold, the Skinny opened a magazine in Manchester called The Skinny North, and they were looking for a deputy editor, and I got a job there, and that was my first full-time gig, which was sort of 2013, 2014, that kind of time. And yeah, since then I've been working for The Skinny and just freelancing over the place. But yeah, I do think it is kind of, a lot of it is kind of luck, but I guess you also have to be in those places to get the luck. You have to be part of the scene to sort of get it, and that's, yeah, I think that's similar to how I fell into it.
Yeah. It'd be interesting for you to talk a little bit about The Skinny, because it's interesting to think about who amplifies film culture, how do audiences get to know? I mean, obviously, venues and festivals will have direct relationships with their audience. They're only the people that already know. So how, in terms of either being someone who may commission work around local film culture, or trying to pitch for work around local film culture. If you could, Tara, maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well. Like how easy is it to do this? So, Jamie, if you want to go first.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's obviously the thing nowadays is most cinemas will have their own channels. They've got their Twitter and their Instagram page, so they can speak directly to their audience. But I think sometimes you might just be speaking to a bubble in that case. That's people who know about. You have to know that Watershed is here, and you have to, because I'm always surprised when I meet people in Edinburgh who don't know Filmhouse is about and what they do. So like, I think it is amazing that this happens. Like, I'll tell them, the Edinburgh Film Festival's on, they don't know what it is. So I think the good thing about the Skinny is it's free. You get it in bars, restaurants, cafes. People pick it up for something to read, and this is maybe a bit of a dream of mine, but hopefully people pick it up and sort of find things that they would never have found elsewhere. They aren't sort of clued into the kind of trendy film culture that might be happening in the city, but maybe they're just a more average film fan who just likes to go to the movies at the weekend, and they maybe find something that sounds really cool that we've done a big feature on. So that is one way I think the Skinny and sort of local film journalists can do that kind of job. They can sort of find people outside of that bubble, because that's one of the big problems in the film industry. I think we're always talking to a bubble. That's why the film industry is probably too white. It's probably it's too male. It's too straight. It's and it's too London. I think we might go into as well. Like there is a sort of bubble, and I think the advantage of being a kind of local film critic is you can maybe try and break that bubble a little bit and sort of speak to the people who maybe don't get spoken to that often, or the criticism isn't always directed to them. So that's what I hope. And then the great thing also about being an editor at the Skinny is I get a chance to work with loads of writers. So there is loads of really talented writers who are very keen to write for not much money. I mean, that's the one disadvantage of the Skinny. We don't have a huge budget, and we are very much a publication for people who are starting out, who maybe want to move on to bigger things. So loads of people who have started at the Skinny who are quite happy to do a feature for £50 are now like writing for the Guardian or Sight and Sound, where they can maybe make it into a kind of full-time career. So that's one of the, I guess, more heartening things about doing that job. It's like, you get a chance to kind of give these people who might not have a voice a platform, and then they can move on and have a really fancy job somewhere else.
Do you have an open pitching? How does it work?
It's I get emails every week, from people who, some people have written elsewhere. They do their own blogs and things like that. Some people haven't written anywhere, and they just have a nice idea, or they might have an outline that sounds interesting. That's really how I do it. We've started recently as well working a lot with people like, especially Edinburgh Film Festival, they do a kind of critics, student critic session, and the Skinny have been involved in that recently. First of all, we publish all the, well, not all the work, some of the work from that session, and I go in and do like a kind of little mini pitching session with them. And I've actually, a lot of those writers sort of keep in touch and contact me and sort of, ask to do more stuff. And, they're all great, and the ones that are really keen sort of seem to keep it up. So that's been a way of finding lots of good writers recently. And again, that's working in partnership with a local venue and a local festival to sort of, work with young critics. And those young critics come from Edinburgh, actually. They bring them from, all over. I think it's open to the whole UK. But it's really nice to just work with local writers as well, because obviously a lot of what we write about is happening in Scotland, so it's easier if the person's there who can go along and can talk about it. So yeah, it's I did fall into the trap when I started the Skinny of maybe relying a bit too much on London critics, because I think as Tara was talking about, it's really hard to get access to screeners, and I was kind of under pressure. I remember my first month at the Skinny, not my first month, it was the first year I'd been there, and the music editor was quite angry at me that I hadn't included I think it was, what was it? It was something like, it was The Dark Knight Rises. It wasn't in the top 10, or we hadn't covered it that year. I can't remember what it was, but he was angry that I hadn't covered this. And I thought, you've got a bloody cheek. He talks about all the weird esoteric music in the world. He would never cover a pop album, but he was telling me I should go out and cover this massive Warner Brothers film. But so I was kind of I thought, I should be covering these big movies, and I was commissioning a lot of London writers to do that because it was just impossible to do it otherwise. But I've really changed tack recently. I've tried to use local writers where I can, and the fact is the films we kind of cover are the type of films that maybe are put out by people like Curzon or Mubi or Altitude, these more sort of smaller distributors who are very happy to give out screeners. So not only are these the films I want to cover, these are actually the ones we can only get access to anyway, so it's a happy coincidence that that's the way it works. So that's the type of films we cover now, and I've kind of given up on trying to cover the big stuff, because as Tara says, everyone covers it, so what's the point? We should be covering. I see myself as having two jobs basically. It's covering what's local in Scotland that maybe not anybody else is talking about, but also maybe giving a Scottish point of view to films that get released nationally, because I think, I'm sure MD who doesn't, every city has their own kind of culture and own sort of personality, and I think Scotland is certainly different from London, and it would be weird if all the criticism we read was just from London. So I think those are the two kind of main roles I think that Scottish, or local press, if you want to call it, have, I would say.
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of things you said so much. The multitude of voices is really important. Like that there are lots of different writers and different people saying things. And definitely, like what you were saying about exhibitors do have their social media and their channels and their comms, obviously, to talk to their audiences. But also one of the things that I think is, it's unusual. It doesn't not exist. Like the first exhibition job I ever had was in a rep house in Australia called the Astor Theatre, and we did it, but that's because we weren't like a real industry of people. We were like me and two other people. But people often in exhibition don't speak honestly about the films to their audience. They speak in comms speak to their audience, and they speak in marketing speak to their audience, and that's cool because that's like what you guys want to do maybe, but like that's not enough for the audience. Like if you think about like how, like when you're talking about like films you want to go see and stuff, and you talk with your friends and things, like, and who do you take your advice most from? Like I'm more likely to believe like somebody I know's opinion because they're going to talk to me honestly than like anything that's copywriting because I know it's copywriting. So even though like you can speak to your audience that way, I think that there's like what a critic does is they speak with like a real honest tone of voice because they're an independent entity. And so that's like something that's really key for me, is that kind of separation. So like while I would say, yeah, totes, there's ways that cinemas and festivals can work with critics and can work with those voices, it's actually important that there's a separation and that there is that kind of critical distance, because what you don't want is to only be talking in ComSpeak. I think you kind of need that differentiation of voices. I remember the first time at the Astor that I had a fight with one of my colleagues, because like we used to write little mini reviews on the back of the calendar, and I wrote a couple of really scathing reviews, and they were like, he was like, why are you doing that? Like we want people to come see the film. I was like, yeah, it's okay if I tell them it's shit, they can still come see it. Like, I'm not saying people shouldn't come see the film. I'm just saying, like, it's not a good film, but come see it and you can talk to me in the box office afterwards if you disagree.
Fear into the heart of every single comms director.
Right, I know, but this is where criticism is different, right? And so one of the things that since 2016, when we started it, Cinema Rediscovered has a film critics workshop attached to it, and Cinema Rediscovered, for anyone who doesn't know, is an archive, classic and repertory film festival. It's run with Watershed in partnership with Southwest Silence, the Curzon Cinema in Clevedon, and a little bit with the Video Shop. And starting that film critics workshop was super important to me. I did a film critics workshop in my career in about the middle of it, which is a weird place to do it, but in 2014 at the Berlinale. And I think that there's two most valuable things that people, young critics, will get out of that. One is that they make some contacts, they meet people in the industry and they can ask somebody who knows things questions, which is really valuable. And two, they kind of like can form a little cohort like that gives them support together, and they can kind of forge their own path. And I think like the main thing that I try to teach on the film critics program that I've run, and it changes because every year I learn something so it gets, I think, better every year. So like the earlier iterations probably weren't as focused as it is now, but the idea about like, if you want to be a critic and you want to work as, or a journalist or whatever, first of all, work out, are you a reviewer, a critic, a journalist? Like, those are all different things. We don't have time to go into the myriad of differences, but like within the landscape of criticism, it's wide. Like, what do you want to do? Where would your voice go? And how will you be a critic? You don't have to be a jobbing critic. Probably you won't be. There's only a few of those. It's worth saying Christina was on the Berlinale Talent Press with me. We did it the same year. She's one of like very few people even to come out of the Berlinale Talent Press who has like a paper gig, you know, like she writes for the Eye. That's quite rare. There's not a lot of those jobs. Like, and that's not just down to luck. Christina's an amazing critic, but just that, you know, there's lots of different paths. But I think that the multitude of voices is incredibly important, and the kind of integrity of those different voices is really important. Mm-hmm. A lot of what I learned on this year's critics program that I ran was that, first of all, half the people on it wouldn't have taken it if I didn't do it online. So thanks to the pandemic for letting me reach new people who couldn't take my course in the past, particularly someone who had chronic illness, like, you know, varying people who didn't live in Bristol or couldn't get to Bristol for various reasons. So it was a bit more open, which I liked. I also learnt that each of them wanted to be critics in completely different ways, and that there should be and there maybe is space and for that. Some of that could be working with, a lot of the time people want to be critics and work in the industry, right? Like, mm-hmm. A lot of people do two jobs. I mean, for a very long time in my career, I was a critic and a programmer. Mm-hmm. Like, I programmed at the Astor Theatre and I kind of worked on their social media and I did all that stuff while being a radio critic and a writer. And then, you know, like, I worked in a video shop while I was a film critic, and, you know, or a bookshop or whatever it was, to kind of make sure that I had enough money, because being a critic doesn't really always pay that well. It's pretty hard to make a living at it. And the thing I see, you know, one of the things I do in my movie job is that I read every review for whatever film and then like curate which ones we're going to load onto the website. And so, I mean, I can tell you that like big films that everybody writes about, they all write the same thing and it's boring, and I'm bored of reading those reviews, and they're the same writers and they're all saying the same thing, and all, like, every
We're on
publication.
Twitter 5 minutes after the premiere anyway.
But like, you know, there's a short film or like an independent or an experimental film that's like probably one of the most amazing films, and nobody's written about it. When I was doing the reviews for John Smith's new short, I was like, Citadel, I was like, is there any reviews of this film? Has no one? And then I literally, like, actually it annoyed me so much, I was like, so I'm going to write about this film, you know? And the same with like Anna Odell's X and Y. I was like, wow, this film played like 3 major film festivals and there's like 1 review of it. like in the English language. I mean, I don't do other language reviews, but you know what I mean? Like, there's interviews with her, but where's the writing on this? Where's all the writing on these films?
And I think that's a key thing, like, not just about films not getting reviews, but like, you know, you guys, if you put on an amazing festival or you put on an amazing event and no one writes about it, you know, obviously it happened, but like if you're looking back in 10 years, you know, if somebody was doing some sort of research about, you know, covering that event, where's the kind of writing about it? Where's the kind of you know, you might have the catalogue, you may have a few tweets about how it happened, but if you don't have a kind of sort of critical analysis of it, or somebody telling you, well, this was the atmosphere of the festival, this was the curation, what worked, what didn't, you know, it's sort of, you don't have a kind of legacy of that event. So I think that's a thing that criticism can do. It can also, as well as promoting your event, you know, and giving you people the heads up, it's also a way to look back at it and sort of, you know, kind of have a discussion with the programmers about what worked and what didn't, and it might, you know, it might make you change your mind about what you program in the future. So yeah, I think that there can be a kind of real kind of conversation between programmers and critics if there is that kind of space given for people to write about what's happening locally.
Yeah, sorry, can I jump
sure.
in again? I think also there's something really key there about like kind of expanding the group of people that are having the conversation. So like you want to have, in a healthy cinephilic conversation, you don't just want your audience only ever to be speaking to like the one programmer or like, you know, the one venue voice. You need them to be speaking to filmmakers, to critics, to writers, to other creatives. You kind of want to like curate a culture and a cinephilic culture around your festival or venue or whatever it is that is like has a multiplicity to it. Like if I think about like where are the best conversations that I have about film, pretty much guaranteed every year is at Rotterdam, and it's because of like, for me, the particular mix of like filmmakers and critics and the type of people that are like interested, and they're not all from the same background. Like some of them are curators, some of them are this or that, but it's a multitude. And I think that like you need that real diversity of perspectives to have a healthy film culture conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a bit of democracy to it now. I think, you know, it is a lot more, I think in some conversation I had with Christina, she called it diffuse. You know, things of, you know, it's obviously with social media, and people have a voice and they use it, and there's a lot of opinions, but in a way that's great. I do want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, but I will ask one more thing, which is, given that this is a conference for film exhibitors, what can we do? How can that relationship around what can festivals and venues and community exhibitors offer to film journalists, critics who are up and coming? How do they signpost that? And what's the flip of that? What can writers in localities do for those things, in your opinion? Jamie, do you want to start?
Well, maybe touched upon it already. You know, I think it is just being in contact. I think one of the key things for me is I would love to know what venues are doing. You know, like I work on a monthly schedule, and I would love to know what my local venues are doing. So sometimes I have to chase them a little bit, and sometimes they're not great about sort of giving me their forward plans. For example, I just found out yesterday I was having a meeting with my friend who works at GFT, and he told me that the Film House are doing a massive Truffaut season. So I would love to know about Francis Truffaut being played in Edinburgh, the city I live in, so I could plan some writing about it. But yeah, I'm hearing it kind of third hand. So like, you know, and there's loads of examples like that. Like, so I think first of all, just sort of be better at communicating what you're planning, because that's how pitching works. You can't sort of turn around a press release with like no notice. You know, if you're going to be a journalist, you have to kind of pitch to an editor ahead of time and sort of give plenty of planning. So that's one thing. I also on Monday I went to a press screening at Glasgow, which is a rare thing. They showed Parallel Mothers. Which is great, and that, again, that's perfect because it's a month. So, like, I think quite often venues will screen films to their staff. Why don't you just invite the press along and say, you know what, we're going to be showing this in a month's time. We're going to be having 20 screenings of it. It would be really great if you could write a review or send some tweets or something like that. And I think because there are people who come along and, you know, maybe half of them would be chancellors who just want to see a free film, but the other half will write something really interesting about it, and you'll both benefit down the way. Like I mentioned, when I started out, I wasn't even getting paid really from the Glasgow Film Festival. I was getting paid in tickets. So if you're worried, oh, we don't have a budget to commission stuff, maybe there are people who might write for tickets, you know. So if you want to get young critics involved, do you want to write some programme notes like the Glasgow Film Festival did, but you don't have the money for it? Give them some free tickets and they will probably do it. I'm sure I would definitely do it if I was 18. I did do it when I was 18. So like I'm sure that you'll find people who will do that.
I agree, except I would say try and get the BFI to give you the money. Please.
Well, obviously try and pay them as well. That would be great. But like if you can't pay them, tickets are the next best thing.
But yeah, I mean, press screenings is, I think, hugely important, like decentralized press screenings. They don't only have to happen in London. I know that when I first came back to the video shop, I did actually contact the Watershed and ask if they did press screenings. I just assumed they did, actually. I asked if I could be added to the press list to come to press screenings, and then I got told, well, we don't really do press screenings anymore. And I was like, oh, okay. And then when I worked here, I was like, so I think maybe we should try and, like I sometimes watch the films in the cinema. Like, we could at least invite a few people along, like who, and you know, it's difficult because I think what you need is like that's a over time thing as well. Like you need to build those relationships over time. So if you run a few and like 2 people come, don't stop them. Like that's not going to be helpful. You need to keep running them and you need to keep inviting people and building those relationships with the people. One of the like things immediately was that like, you know, we have 2 universities here. Like, they have a university magazine, and they write about films in the university magazine, which goes out to a lot of young students. Like, you know, it's kind of a no-brainer. Like, invite the student editor to your cinema to see stuff. You know, give them tickets, let them, like, see things, invite them to come to stuff. I think the invitation in is really important as well. Like, the assumption that you're there is not enough. Like, I know when I... in every circumstance, like when I was in London and I went to university opposite like the South Bank, I still felt like uncomfortable going into the BFI. Like I still didn't feel really like I was invited there until they made me a student ambassador. And even then it was like, you know, still like this big scary building. When I moved to Bristol, I didn't know from the outside that this was a cinema. Someone had to bring me here and show me that it had cinema screens in it. Like I think that you could easily not know that there's like huge cinephiles who love and are passionate about cinema in your city or in, you know, like in your like sphere that you just maybe haven't quite connected with yet. Obviously the best way to connect with them is to like sit in your own cinema and watch movies because that's where they are. So like, you know, don't just like look around for them on the internet. Like I know a lot of people do that, but it's like, do you know what? They're probably in the front row of your screen on like a Tuesday afternoon or like watching every film like that comes out. Like go see who's coming to your afternoon sessions. I guarantee they're the cinephiles. Like you will find them.
One thing I would also say is actually the venues should probably just use the local talent. This is going to seem like a gripe, but I sometimes feel like, especially in Scotland, sometimes I feel like the relationship between the Scottish critics, the Scottish venues and the London critics is a bit like that. Do you remember that meme that was going about a few years ago with one couple walking in one direction and the guy's head gets turned by the glamorous girl going, I feel like that glamorous girl is London film critics sometimes and the guy turning the head is the local venues. And I feel like, you know, there's critics up here who cover you day in, day out all year. Why, when you've got a big premiere, do you invite, you know, Jonathan Romney or Robbie Collin up? You know, when those guys, no harm to those guys. They're fantastic. They do a great job. But there are certainly critics who live on your doorstep who could do just as good a job. And you'd also save on flights. You'd save on your greenhouse emissions. You know, it's like it's a win-win, I think. And it's just, as Tara says, building that relationship and sort of, you know, maybe you can show that if local people can do Q&As, maybe London would let these venues do more Q&As throughout the year, because that is one thing that is an issue, is bringing talent to the cities outside of London to, you know, host these premieres. And I think if you showed that, there's talent here who can not only, the venues can also host them, but you have talent who can come and sort of give these films the kind of love they need. That was one way to help, I would say.
No one's going to be more passionate about your own venue than your own customers as well.
Sure.
Okay, so have we got any questions here?
Yeah, do you want me to get up there? So you can hear me?
I would love that.
All right, well, I'll do that then.
Please join us.
It's the Mentimeter man. Yeah, we've got a few here. Is that on? Something up there. Anyway, you can hear me anyway. So there's a sort of a more of a kind of reviewers are great statement here. So this is from an exhibitor. Reviews are for programmers too. We can't see everything, and often we don't get sent screeners either. So especially for shorts. So it's really important to read critics covering smaller releases. So that's a kind of a bit of a yay for you. There was a question about, can you talk more about the opportunities in film criticism beyond the written word?
Yeah.
And they mentioned video essays, audio and stuff, but podcast is a big thing as well. Is that something you've kind of developed out?
Yeah, so I like I said, I did a lot of radio, mostly in Melbourne. When I came back to the UK, actually, I did radio for a while at Monocle, but I had to get a train to London every time, obviously, to do it. Sometimes you could do it down the phone, but the fee is like half the price if you're doing it over the phone and not in person in the studio. And then, unfortunately, at one point, the fee went down and it became like it was costing me money to go to the studio to like record because the trains from Bristol to London are not that cheap, so like it wasn't really viable. Sometimes I still go to do BBC, but that's a little bit more like financially viable for me, but I don't do a lot of radio anymore. I have done podcasting in the past. I would say if you're doing podcasting, a couple of things for me is that like either you need to have like excellent across the board skills, and I don't just mean like as a podcaster and a critic. You also need to be like excellent at your own marketing. You need to be excellent at like your own admin. You need to be really good at production of your podcast and all of that stuff, or you need to hire other people to do that for you, so you kind of need a budget for it. Video essays is an interesting one because actually there is some money in video essaying, depending on where you're doing it. So like video essays for if you're doing them for DVD releases and stuff, like for Arrow, Indicator, BFI, all those sorts of things that do like DVD and Blu-ray releases where often they have video essays and they commission them. The fees for those are okay, so like there is money to be made making those sorts of video essays. Outside of that, you're kind of looking at like festivals or like your own Vimeo or YouTube channel, so monetizing that can be trickier. We have, like when I used to work at Watershed, we have shown video essays as introductions to films a couple of times as well. We have an extremely good local video essayist, Jonathan Bygraves, who is just fantastic. So, like, again, know who's in your city and what talents they have. Intros to films don't have to be spoken. There are other ways of doing that. But I guess, like, those, and there are lots of other ways to do criticism. I mean, I'm a very big advocate for creative criticism. I support people who want to do poetry or like whatever. My partner and I made an hour-long video essay that we showed in Rotterdam. We also staged a like reenactment of Mitchell and Kenyon and filmed it on 16mm one year at the festival there. So like there are like performative, lots of different ways to do criticism in my opinion. I think they're trickier to get people to agree to. I would say that I've had more support in Rotterdam than I have in the UK for doing that kind of work. So I don't know who you would get to agree to let you do it here. That said, I did give a talk here at Watershed on Agnes Varda dressed as a potato. So, you know.
Okay. Did it go down well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it went well, yeah.
Jamie, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to add to that, I would actually just add that maybe I would say criticism you don't always have to think about it as being paid. Like Tara says, there are only a handful of jobs. So I think you have to either decide what route you're going to go down. Are you going to try and be the mainstream critic who covers the mainstream titles, but everyone's trying to do that, or do you find your own path? And I think if you start doing it out of that reason, you're really passionate about it and you really love it, then the jobs may come. So I would say, do that. Like some of the best criticism I read, actually, probably people aren't getting paid much. It's blogs. It's people like David Cairns at Shadowplay. There's lots of newsletters that I read now that aren't sort of beyond the traditional mastheads that are putting out the best criticism, I would say, and that's then people that they get funded directly from people. So it's what's the
Crowdsourced.
Yeah,
platform?
like Substack.
Substack, that's
yeah,
one.
Christina does a Substack,
Yeah.
and she won an award for her.
Exactly.
Substack,
So
yeah.
Sisters
that-
under the mink.
So that way you can go directly to the people if you write good stuff, people will probably chuck you a few quid for it, and actually you can probably get paid better than if you were scrabbling away at BFI or
like Coffeo and all those kind of things where you could be tipped a couple of quid.
exactly. And I think if the writing is good, people will probably pay for it eventually. So like I think that's a way to go. You don't always have to go down the mainstream. Ask for somebody to pay you money. Ask an editor like me to pay you money to do it. You could go off and do it, and then find an audience that way.
Okay. There's a specific question for you, Jamie, which is, could you talk a bit about how the Skinny as a whole, as the publication, decide what films, events to cover? As there's so much in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and you've talked a bit about finding the sort of offbeat sort of thing, but as a magazine, do you have a criteria?
I mean, one of the tough things is there is so much, and I feel guilty sometimes that I can't give a lot of great events space. I feel like every month there's a really good event that we should be covering and maybe can't. So you just have to sometimes make a judgment call, We do sort of partnerships with a lot of them anyway. Like so, the big two, Glasgow Film Festival and Edinburgh Film Festival, we have sort of long-standing partnerships where we cover. But I would say some of the best film events are these smaller ones. Just something like Squiff, for example, is great to write about because that's such a forward-thinking festival which has so many great ideas about access and being completely intersectional and bringing everyone involved. So yeah, we give that probably more space than you would imagine for such a small festival. Again, something like Alchemy in Hawick, it's not really it's not in the central belt, which we usually cover, but we cover it anyway because it's doing such amazing things in terms of grassroots film, but also it's a very international festival. So yeah, I kind of judge it more on. I mean, it's sometimes just a personal thing. Like I really love what that event is doing, and I think it needs. So it doesn't. It's not really to do with the size of the festival or how much they pay in ads or anything like that. It's the ad revenue and the editorial is very separate. We don't sort of discuss it. So it's usually, are they doing something interesting? But I always feel guilty that I can't cover everything.
There's a question for both of you, I think, here. So, do distributors try to stick their noses into your reviews, or are they reluctant to share their films for reviews?
So, thankfully, I'm not the kind of critic that most distributors care about. This is where the flip side of I proudly have never had a pull quote on a poster, so I'm not that kind of a critic. Nobody cares what you're writing for censors of cinema. Like in terms of like distributors, they're not looking at that, so that's fine for me. Except I did have one experience when when I went to Cannes and I saw the Bling Ring, and it's the only time I have ever, and I would never do it again. I did a round table. It was my first time doing a round table. It was years ago, and I was like, I should try doing a round table. And obviously, like, what I learnt was doing a round table is really terrible because, like, some other critic asks a question that has, like, your readers will have no interest in, and so you get nothing good that you can really use, and you're not really, like, having the best kind of content. So afterwards, I used to write for this entertainment site in Australia called The Vine. I talked to my editor about it, and I was like, I don't really think that anything from the round table is usable. I don't really want to do it. And she was like, cool, we'll just bin that piece. Don't worry about it. And then the distributor quite aggressively would, like, because it was Roadshow, it was a big distributor, Village Roadshow. So like they would like quite aggressively would be emailing me like, where's your piece? Like it's not up. And I'd be like, I'm not writing it. And they literally were like, we're going to contact your editor. Like I was like, you can, but my editor and I have agreed not to run the piece. But they were like, I don't know, it was weird. They were kind of threatening to go to my editor. And I was like, go to my editor.
Mom.
Like, I'm a freelance like, what? Go for it.
Yeah, I find most of the distributors really cool, actually. I like the ones I work with anyway, like I say, it's usually the smaller ones, Curzon, maybe Altitude. The PRs there are lovely, and they if you give it a 2 stars or 5 stars, they don't really care. They just want the coverage. They're very happy to see it. The issue usually comes from either the individual filmmakers themselves, who will find your address and try and tell you got my film wrong. Please change it. And obviously
Really?
that's. I also find some festivals are actually a bit more precious about reviews than the film. So like I have had some run-ins from festival directors who have been really unhappy about things I've written, and that's one thing about being local. I think you can't always be a cheerleader. I love to support things, but if you know, I think we have to be honest as well, and I think that's one thing. That's where there can be a tension between the local critics and the local festivals. Is, they can feel that you've sort of let them down by giving them maybe too honest a review. So that's the only issue. And it's not just. I wouldn't name any names, but like there have been festivals where usually I get invited along, and you know they'll pay for my travel and stuff. But then if I write something, I never get invited again. So. Right. I feel like that's why I think you should always maybe sometimes take some critics with a pinch of salt. If I think some critics maybe love the getting the red carpet rolled out for them, and that may change their opinion.
Right, okay.
So if you see a critic who maybe gets invited to a lot of festivals, maybe, and they're always having glowing reviews, maybe they're not the most honest, I would say.
Yeah, there's also like, I mean, there's now a whole thing too about like, you know, being sent cakes and, you know, like, and like putting it on your Instagram and performing your like the gifts that the distributors and stuff send you. And I think it is a really tricky, I mean, I don't get sent that stuff, so it's not a problem for me. My integrity is intact. But I think that like it is tricky as an area where it's like we all want to have good relationships with exhibitors and distributors, and that's super important because we all do need to work together. But critics have to be allowed to be critical. Like that is the difference, like, because they're not your comms team.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the worst thing I ever heard was there was a film that was released, shall remain nameless, that had a scene with a nail bomb in it. So they sent nail bombs to all the journalists in Belfast. Well, you can imagine how that went down. Fake nail bombs.
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Oh, well, we have one or two more. Let me see. We're almost wrapped up here. There is a question that I'll paraphrase a little bit, just in terms of our film critics and journalists. Sort of, is it a dying breed? I think is the kind of nature of the you know, within this kind of promotional world. Is it very difficult to kind of keep going? I suppose.
Well, it's weird. In some ways, I would say there's more criticism and better criticism now than ever. Like I was saying, I think there's so many good writers out there who are doing it off their own back, you know. And so in one way, yes, there's tons, but in another way, it is a dying breed, because the one thing I fear is it becomes a kind of middle class pursuit. The problem is it's so hard to get paid. And if you have to live in London, it's incredibly expensive. So the only people who can really do that are people who don't have to worry about paying rent, basically. So it'd be a real shame if that's what we're left with in sort of 10 years, if it's all just sort of people who have been handed their careers because they can do these internships indefinitely until the job comes along. Whereas if you're a working class critic, you know, who maybe doesn't live in London, you have to pay the rent, and maybe you have to have a day job and only do criticism part time. And that criticism is probably going to be great, but it's a shame they're not getting a sort of full time gig out of it.
Yeah, I think actually for me the bigger worry is that we're falling into this pattern where, because so the it's always a flip, like two sides of the same coin, right? Like, because there's not as many staff writers as there used to be, there's not as many staff jobs. Most jobs are freelance, so there's this big pool of freelancers, which has its positives because obviously we need this big multiplicity of voices, which is great. But some of the flip side to that is actually we're not getting the multiplicity of voices because there's like 10 people who write everywhere, which also means now, and I think this is a really big problem for me personally, I see this as an issue, is that the independent publications no longer have their independent identities. They're all the same. Like, because they're literally the same writers. Like, there's like, you know, and especially the last 2 years, while only like 5 critics have been going to festivals. So, like, if you read anything out of like Venice or Cannes this year, it's like 5 people have opinions, and they wrote them for Sight and Sound, for Little White Lies, for like, you know, for like every publication, and it's like the same 5 people. And so I think that's a problem for me, because I think, well, that is then a very closed shop. And the pressure on the one side, you can understand it, because if you're paying for yourself to go to Cannes or Venice, you need to make money back on that. Like, I mean, I remember when I went to Cannes, I wrote like for 5 different publications, because I was like, I need to make money to support the cost of me going to Cannes, right? Like, you know, I had to pay for my own flight and accommodation. So, like, the economics of it are that, like, of course the critic is going to pitch to every publication they can, and of course they're going to write for as many places as they can. But the downside to that is that I'm like, okay, so like sometimes I'm like, how many reviews are there on this film? Oh wow, like this one person wrote 3 reviews on this film for 3 different publications. It's like, it's literally the same. It's literally the same. Like, and because also like the structure of what people then feel like they have to do is they don't have their own approach to criticism anymore. They write a review in a style which is like little introductory sentence, way too much synopsis, a little bit of opinion at the end, and it's become so formulaic that again there's like no room for it to breathe. Whereas like if you read historical criticism, which was one of my favorite things to do, is to like look at old movies and find the criticism on that. It's brilliant. Like, you know, what were the views that were films coming out of like the 50s and 60s and stuff? How were people writing? And like, you know, there's like letters in old Sight and Sound, like back in the archives of Sight and Sound, of like, you know, Francois Truffaut like writing to Sight and Sound like angrily about something, and like, you know, people were having conversations across platforms, and I don't know, just like people were writing in a different way. Now they were writing in a different way because the whole industry structure was different and the economics were different. Not all of those things were good, so I'm not like advocating for going back to how things were, but I do think we are in danger right now of just like, there is a multiplicity of voices, like Jamie says, but they're you have to do the work to find them. Mm-hmm. Like the headlines are the same 5 people.
Thank you. I think I'm going to have to say thank you to our Mentimeter.
The Mentimeter has spoken.
And thank you to you all. I guess I just would be nice to sort of wrap up on a kind of, I guess, give you the floor for a couple of minutes each to give. What would you like to see? What's the sort of like, how that kind of big question of like engagement, like what's the thing going forward? You know, if you're 22 and living in Bristol or Nottingham or, you know, Derby or wherever, what's the path? What do you see as the path? What could the people in this room do to support those people that want to write about films and spread their sort of passionate love of film, which is why we're all doing this?
Okay, I'll start. Well, I mean, first of all, you could pitch to the Skinny. If you're in Scotland, that would help. Yeah, I mean, I hope you don't feel that the path is to go to London and get in debt or travel to festivals and spend a lot of money and not maybe make a return. I hope that isn't, you know, it's strangely, the pandemic felt like it was opening things up. I probably saw more films over the pandemic because of access to festivals and access to screeners than I ever have, you know. And I see that door slowly closing as things open up, which is such a shame. So it's clear that can happen. They can give out screeners, so you don't always have to travel to London, or you don't have to travel to Sundance to see the new film. If there was a way that door could stay open, I would love that. And I don't know how venues can help, but if there is a way that you can convince the distributors that no one's going to steal your film, honest, nobody wants a bootleg of, you know, I don't know, The Power of Your Dog or whatever. Like we want to see it, and we're going to write about it, and we're not going to share it with the whole world. That would be great. Yeah, but I just hope that people. I really hope it doesn't become a middle class pursuit. I hope that people who don't, who aren't white, who aren't middle class, who aren't straight, they who aren't men, they get the chance to talk, and they get the chance to write about what's out there, because otherwise it does become incredibly dull, incredibly boring, and it is the same sort of 5 voices, and not only the same 5 voices of people who all look exactly the same and all have the same opinions, and all sort of sit around and probably discuss the film over dinner, you know. So that's so I would hate if that's what film criticism became.
Thanks, Jamie.
Also with the piracy thing, the wildest weird irony of that is that actually, like, not sending screeners or not allowing access to films is that, like, I know critics who pirate films to do their job. So maybe, like, don't make them watch a badly pirated version of the movie so they can see it better and write it better. But I guess, I don't know, like, in a big, I guess my dream world scenario would be, like, go to the BFI, convince them to give you money that is for this kind of cinephilic cultural engagement that includes nurturing your local talent, that isn't just, like, it needs to broaden the idea of what local talent is. So it is your filmmakers, definitely. It is your potential programmers, of course, but it's also your writers and your critics, and it's other people who are doing other creative pursuits. So get the money to kind of support that. Like I think the definition needs to be widened. You could create really interesting creative projects with people in your cities or, you know, at your festivals or whatever, depending on who is there. And don't like set what it is before you meet the people. Meet the people, find out where their talents are and what they're good at and what they want to do, and then shape it. And then let them kind of do it themselves as well. Like, you know, I think that's the key thing, because it might be that there's someone in your city who, like, if you gave them enough money, they could write, like, start up an amazing film journal. Or it could be that if you, like, there could be someone where you are that if you had enough money and you gave it to them, they could, like, make video essays for an entire season that you're doing. Like, there's probably somebody with some skills around something. Maybe they do a limited podcast series or whatever. Like, but get the money from the BFI and pay them and do it, is what I would say.
Thanks, Tara. Something to feed into the 10-year consultation, I feel. I want to say thank you both so much for coming today and for all of your wonderful questions. We have a 15-minute break, I believe, back in Screen 1 for 3:30 to hear from Delphine and forthcoming attractions. So thank you very much, and thank you both.
Thank you.